We're very happy to be partnering on this event with the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee, as well as our great partners, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Thought it would be poignant to kind of talk about the Greatest Generation in connection with President Ford before we begin. So in eulogizing President Ford, Tom Brokaw said about the Greatest Generation that theirs was a generation accustomed to difficult missions, shaped by the sacrifices and the deprivations of the Great Depression, a generation that gave up its innocence and youth to then win a great war and save the world. And when that generation came home from war, they were mature beyond their years and eager to make the world they had saved a better place. It is for this we honor and celebrate the Greatest Generation. So before we're gonna watch a video, but I do want to quickly mention a few upcoming events here at the Ford Museum. We will once again be a venue for Art Prize, which starts on September 19th, so please come out and visit. It's free. And on October 29th, we will host Mark Updegrove as he talks about his latest book, Make Your Mark, Lessons in Character from 7 Presidents, which one of those is President Ford. For more information about these and other upcoming programs, please check out our website, fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now we have a video.
In my country, France, like in many European countries, the memory of World War II is everywhere. Every city, every small town, every village, like the village where I grew up in Burgundy, have stories to tell about World War II. Stories about a military defeat, stories about a humiliation, a collapse, a division, stories about betrayals, stories about refugees, stories about prisoners of war, stories about police roundups against children just because they were Jewish, stories about men and women in uniform who died in action in June 1940. But we also have stories of hope, of courage, of dignity, of purpose. And what America, what our allies did for us and with us in 1944 is a story that can be summed up in a very simple way. The French flag that you see behind me would no longer exist without America's greatest generation, without our allies, without the French underground. And for that, we will be grateful forever. America changed our destiny forever. We will never, ever forget that. I was not there, but I know and I will remember. French nation as a whole will always remember.
I have been reading about this guy Hitler over in Europe, and I was convinced that probably we'd be in that war.
I knew there was going to be a war. There was no doubt about it. Germany was arming. Hitler talked about the drive to the east.
So I had to make a decision. Do I wait until I was drafted, or do I join something?
We interrupt this program to take you to NBC News.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press.
President Roosevelt says that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from the air.
The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
So there are people in government who knew this was coming. And there were enough danger signs out there in the world that we began to get ready. So there was a lot of buildup going on before Pearl Harbor. And then when Pearl Harbor happened, everything ratcheted up even further.
Laying underneath the truck, a German patrol came down the road, and they were kind of checking the landmines we had set. They opened up the .50 caliber. They said there was a patrol, at least 35, 40 men, and later on there was more.
That was my first look at the Rhine River, and I was just amazed. And all of a sudden, bang! Well, the sniper from the other side took a shot at me, and he hit the bumper.
We were getting near Dachau, and we saw 4 or 5 guys there with striped clothes. And we wondered, well, where'd they get those striped clothes? But come to find out, they were from Dachau, prisoners. They were Jewish.
When we were eating, all of us managed to save a little on our plate because the fence was full of people with their empty plate, hoping for leftovers, you know. So we always managed to save a little and scrape on their plate through the fence when we were through, and was talking about that at our church.
Afterwards, a lady came up from our church. She said she was one of those people.
I was on the street in Bremerton, Washington, and a newsboy yelling, you know, the extra. I said, what the heck? Roosevelt dead. It's too late for him to enjoy this ending of the war.
There was another trip to see where they dropped a bomb in Hiroshima, and yeah, that was flat. It was a terrible sight to see. Nothing there, just flat.
I often said, you know, the big bands really won the war for us. The music, it was just great.
And there were crowds all over the pier, clapping and screaming and yelling. And when I saw that Statue of Liberty, I saluted that gal. She seemed to be saying, welcome home, soldier. You won the war. America is still free.
My name is Brian Howenstein. I am the co-chair of the Greatest Generation Celebration. Wow, what a crowd we have here tonight. I think this is probably one of the largest we've seen here at the Ford. Good evening. It's a true honor to welcome you all to this very special occasion here at the Gerald R. Ford Museum. As we continue our celebration of the greatest generation, the men and the women who defended freedom, shaped the modern world, and whose sacrifices we still benefit from today. As co-chair of the Greatest Generation Celebration, I can think of no better setting and no better speaker for tonight's program Tonight we are privileged to be joined by someone whose personal story is inseparably tied to the legacy we gather to honor. Susan Eisenhower is a respected author, strategist, policy advisor, and international speaker. She has served as chairman emerita of the Eisenhower Institute, advised U.S. presidents and foreign leaders, and testified before Congress on matters of national security and public leadership. But perhaps most importantly for us tonight, she has dedicated her life to preserving and sharing the values and vision of her grandfather, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. For me, this evening holds special meaning. During World War II, my grandfather, Colonel Ralph Howenstein, served closely alongside General Dwight D. Eisenhower in London as part of the Intelligence Division for the European Theater of Operations. Like General Eisenhower, my grandfather believed in duty, in unity, and in fighting for something greater than oneself. Their partnership helped pave the way for the success of one of the most significant military operations in history, the Normandy invasion, and ultimately the liberation of Europe from tyranny. Susan Eisenhower not only carries her grandfather's name, she carries his enduring spirit. Through her writings, her speeches, and her lifelong public service, she helps us remember the leadership, the values, and the sacrifice of the greatest generation. And that is why she's here tonight, to reflect on the enduring impact of that generation, to honor the legacy they left behind, and to help us better understand how their values continue to shape our world. At the conclusion of her remarks, Susan will be joined on stage by Joel Westfall, the Deputy Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, for a conversation. Following their discussion, she will leave time to take questions from the audience. So I encourage you to listen closely, reflect deeply, and consider what you'd like to ask. So, on behalf of the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee and all of us gathered here tonight, it's my privilege and my personal honor to welcome to the stage Susan Eisenhower.
Well, I must say, I thought that video was so remarkable, I felt really quite teary myself. So let me thank you for inviting me to be here tonight to help the Greatest Generation celebration bring a culmination to these wonderful set of events. I must say, before I get into my official remarks, I wish my students from the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College were here. I'm taking 8 of them to Normandy again in March. And I think it's one of the greatest learning lessons for young people. So I have to say that I want to join everyone who is dedicated to keeping the memory of the greatest generation alive. One of the things my students find most compelling is when I tell them that the people who came on shore on D-Day were their age. This is something incomprehensible to rising generations, and I think it is incumbent on all of us to continue in any way we can to keep this story alive. So I'd like to offer a special thanks to the Celebration Committee for inviting me. Let me say how deeply moved I am to be at the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation event as well, and also of course, the center, the Howenstein Center for Presidential Studies. They all do a remarkable job, and Gleaves Whitney, Joel Westfall, and of course Brian do amazing jobs in keeping this work alive. It's also a bonus that Colonel Ralph Hohenstein was associated with my grandfather during the war. There is no more appropriate place to have this event, I believe, than in Michigan. And I'm sure that in between my talk and other things, events you've attended, you've seen the slideshow about the remarkable contribution that Michigan played in this story. Not only that, but I think Gerald Ford stands out as one of our presidents who was very, very much part of the Greatest Generation. Indeed, he served in the Navy, and his contribution to the war effort was well recognized. He led, like other leaders who had been part of World War II, with a sense of common purpose and a mission larger than themselves. I'd like to make an observation, if we could go back to Normandy for a second. I've been traveling there off and on since the 1970s. When I first went there, there were no car parks. There was nothing there. There weren't even outposts for the park rangers, the American Battle Monuments Commission. It wasn't that long since the cemetery had been built. And if you veered off the cow paths, you could be blown up in the fields in the 1970s still. I met so many of the people who were involved in this story, including that French resistance woman who is the opening to The Longest Day. She was still alive when I was there. And at that time, the way the story was told, it was a leadership story. And so almost all of the attention in the immediate aftermath of World War II was about the generals, about this alliance. It was new. It was the first time in military history that there was a unified, integrated national coalition and actually I think coalition is the wrong word, of course, it should be alliance. This was the first in history, and Dwight Eisenhower was the first general in history to control land, sea, and air in a multinational alliance. And that was the story in the beginning. Then in the late 80s and into the 90s, I think probably after Ronald Reagan went for the 40th anniversary, the Boys of Pontohawk, you may remember that, the focus turned to what you might say the every GI story. And this was an opportunity, starting in that period, for people to begin to recognize that among them at these celebrations were people who had actually fought there. And increasingly, they were interviewed. Of course, Stephen Ambrose did so much to contribute to interviews between veterans who wanted to share their memories. But this was the first time the public was really exposed to the faces of the people that I tell my students about. And so, it's hard for the students, again, back to them, hard to help them get their minds around the size and the scale of this world war. We heard last night that there is a debate about whether, was it 65 million or 80 million people who perished during this time. Whatever it is, and as we were talking about rounding errors last night, we don't need to know. It was something on a scale that nobody will ever be able to fully grasp. In any case, I think that Tom Brokaw played an extraordinary role here. He was not the first, by the way, to coin that expression, but like a good communicator, he knew that was the title to give his book. And I can say that as we see many of our veterans beginning to pass from the scene, and actually many of them are going more quickly than ever, they must know that even though passing on is part of the cycle of life, their legacies will live on long after their passing. We're already seeing, as a result of this, some necessity to rethink how we tell this story. But I'd like to say again that Tom Brokaw has assured that the achievements of the greatest generation will always be recalled. It's up to us not just to tell the story of those we know, but the stories of lesser-known figures as we continue to learn. Their stories are sources of inspiration for the students I teach, for people who are in the military themselves, and even for people in industry. They are remembered for their audacity, their tenacity, and their drive.
as well as their resilience in the face of unthinkable tragedy. I knew two people I'd like to mention very quickly. The first is someone who would come under the heading of well-known, but not very well-known, who I hope someday will get a lot more attention. Her name was Jacqueline Cochran. She was born Bessie Mae Pittman in 1906. Her father was a sawmill builder. In the 20s and 30s, she built a cosmetic company that in her later life, became one of the most important cosmetic companies, believe it or not, in New York. But her husband, soon-to-be, encouraged her to take up flying. She was flying solo within 3 weeks of taking lessons. And in 1941, Cochran was asked to identify 27 highly qualified women pilots to ferry military aircraft around the United Kingdom, and that was called the Air Transport Auxiliary. She was selected by Hap Arnold, General Henry Arnold, to organize the women's flying training detachments, and later to form the Civilian Women's Air Force Service Pilots. They were known as WASPs, W-A-S-P. Okay, as director, this was a lady who built a business around cosmetics, okay? We got that, folks? Between 1943 and 1944, 1,074 women flew 60 million miles to ferry aircraft and personnel around Allied countries. And WASP flew every military aircraft, including a Boeing B-17 and B-29 bombers. They were disbanded in 1944, and she won an array of medals, but also for her later records. Get this, folks. This woman of this audacity and tenacity, on May 18, 1953, became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. And by the time of her death in 1980, she held more speed, altitude, and distance records than any other male or female pilots in aviation history, according to the Smithsonian Institution. This was a woman who learned from the war, was not afraid, and would never stop. She never stopped, indeed. She flew solo to Paris to try and convince Dwight Eisenhower to run for president. Well, I don't know how to respond to that, actually, but okay. So many other stories are left untold, but the next category I'd like to talk about are the people who never felt comfortable in talking about their experience. One person who was the head of a Fortune 100 company, who I got to know because we had some interaction when I was in my consulting business. Somehow somebody told me that he'd come on shore on D-Day. Well, I asked him about that, and he said, I don't want to talk about it. Okay, well, I had a developing professional relationship with this man for 5 years, and every time I'd go, I'd ask him one more question, very respectful of the fact that he didn't want to talk about certainly the invasion itself, and I understood that, but I asked him once what his unit was. He said, I don't want to talk about it. Well, finally, after the 5th or 6th year, I said, you know, our project is over now, and I may not see you again, but could you just tell me what you learned from the experience? He said, keep moving. Many of our speakers this week have spoken about the horrors of this war, the catastrophe of the catastrophic destruction. According to World War II Museum, one of the most prevalent symptoms of PTSD is avoidance. That explains why this titan of commerce unwillingness even to visit the hallowed beaches of Normandy where he came of age. He would not talk about it, and no one still knows what he saw. But judging from what I learned about the unit he was in, he was first off the landing craft. He was a signal guy. And they had to, of course, establish communications immediately. But I was respectful, and I always will be. But how sorry maybe we all are because he felt he could not talk about it. These heroes suffered so much: noise, exposure, unrelenting physical exertion, often without enough food, enough sleep. According to the World War II Museum, an estimated 1 million servicemen saw what can be considered sustained combat. Get this, 40% of medical discharges during the war were psychiatric conditions, the vast number of them from combat stress. I think some of them didn't survive survival guilt. I speculate that in some cases, the bond that was formed between the people who fought together was sometimes stronger than their own patriotic feelings. They were there for their pals. They were there for their fellow brothers. And those relationships built were going to be the impetus that kept them going. No wonder there were psychological issues. And so one day, just this last year, before I went back to Normandy, I went to pick up my dry cleaning, and there was a woman there who asked for my credit card, and I gave it to her, and she said, "You're Susan Eisenhower." I said, "Yes, I'm a Susan Eisenhower." And she said, you're related to Dwight Eisenhower, correct? And I said, yes. And she said, my father came on shore on D-Day. And I said, oh my goodness, well, you're here, so I feel that you must have survived the war. He must have survived the war. And she said, he did. And then she told me that, and I asked her, is he still with us? And she said, no. And I said, well, how long did he live? And she said, he committed suicide when I was 5 years old. So she went on to tell me that she went to his unit's reunion, and she saw a man who looked at, who she thought might have been in his unit, and she asked him, and he said yes, and she said, did you know my father? And the individual looked at her and said, because her name tag only said Miss Wilson, he looked at her and he said, your name's Lynn, isn't it? And she said, how do you know? And he said, because your father told me before the war was over, that when the war was over, he was going to go home, get married, have a daughter, and name her for Vera Lynn. The two of us, I went in to get my dry cleaning, and the two of us ended up crying on each other's shoulders. So despite these, the desperate times and the emotional upheaval, remember that 10 million men were drafted. And yet, they had no emotional preparation for what they were about to do. As the war got more and more intense, some of them didn't have nearly enough training to satisfy everybody's deepest desires, but they accomplished their missions. And they left the areas they invaded with citizens who are today deeply grateful, not only for the liberation, but the way our troops treated the locals. And they're still talking about it. You can go back to any one of those battlefields today. Look in the Netherlands, for instance. There are still people who have adopted a grave and still leave flowers every year. It's a remarkable, remarkable legacy. Even if this group had not come back to build modern America, it's an extraordinary legacy. In the long arc of history, however, and that's what we're going to be moving into that period, I believe that there may be coming to the time when leadership and the everyman GI story will merge. They will be fully integrated, I think, because that's the way stories have to be. That the longer the distance, the more the bigger picture comes into play. In industry, in politics, and in the military, this victory was also the older generation's victory, too. William Knudsen, later General Knudsen, was from this area. He was born, his experience was as senior manager for operations at Ford Motor Company and the General Motors that led to his appointment, a 3-star general appointment to become Director of War Production and Air Technical Service Command. The growing airport, this is the man who is behind many of the statistics you've seen today. He was born in 1879. Others who played a pivotal role, the leadership of the military, for instance, the ones who decided what the operations were, what the strategy was, how the resources would be allocated, and how to lead the men who delivered the victory, were all born in an earlier generation. George Marshall, 1880, he was born. He was the architect of World War II. Douglas MacArthur was also born in 1880, an earlier, like George Marshall, that earlier period. Dwight Eisenhower, born in 1890, first commander of NATO later, and also two-term president. Omar Bradley was born in 1893. George Patton was born in 1885, and Matt Ridgway, who was one of the younger ones, was born in 1895. The only general at that time who was part of this generational gap, this generational period we're talking about, which is 1901 to 1924, was James Gavin, who was born in 1907. Anyway, for the older generation, they too had their trials with fire. And what came out of it was a kind of lasting sense of darkness. Just think, George Marshall, all of the men I just named, had to confront and probably be very much part of World War I. They suffered through the Spanish flu influenza. They suffered through the Great Depression, and some of them were worried that they wouldn't have jobs anymore. And then they had World War II, and they too reported for duty, often including many of our fathers and grandfathers in this audience. But at the end of the day, this takes nothing away from the greatest generation that Tom Brokaw describes. These were the men who brought that light to one of the darkest centuries the world has ever seen. And I was moved myself in my own book, How Ike Led, the principles behind Eisenhower's decision, and pleased to be able to include a quote that Dwight Eisenhower sent to General Frederick Morgan after the war was over. I'm just going to paraphrase this quote, but he said in essence that he saw his job, and this is after World War II, before he even became president. He viewed his job as to set out to stabilize this world that had gone half mad, to stabilize this and to put it on a sound footing so the next generation, the one we call the greatest generation, could work for human betterment. Well, I go to Normandy and I take my time to reflect. Sometimes it's hard to avoid attracting attention, but I get up nice and early in the morning. And you go to the cemetery, and there are the remains of legions of 20-year-old remains that reside in carefully marked cemeteries there in Normandy and all over the world. They never saw adult life. Their parents never had their grandchildren, and the cost of their lives will forever be felt. So let me leave you on this note. When Dwight Eisenhower, on the 10th anniversary of D-Day, Dwight Eisenhower had become President of the United States. And everybody wanted him to go to Normandy, and he said, no, he won't. He won't because he said, this is too sacred, and I'm not going to ever politicize it. So he sent a gift to St. Mary-Glise so that they could make this part of their celebration, and this is where the very, very worrisome airborne decision was made and was impacted there. The 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne Divisions dropped in that general area. And then he went to Camp David, and he saw no one, no family members, no one for a whole day. Was in complete silence for a whole day. So 10 years after that, he and Walter Cronkite went to Normandy. And Normandy, remember, is a way of kind of referring to the whole western section of the European War. He went there, and they got to the American cemetery, and Walter Cronkite asked him how he felt when he was there. And in his tribute to you, greatest generation, he said, "These boys gave us another chance. Thank you for that."
Thank you all for being here. I'm Joel Westphal. I'm the Deputy Director as well as the Chairman of the Greatest Generation. I have some prepared questions. We'll get through those, and then we're going to kick it to you. So the first one, and you kind of alluded to this in your opening, in your remarks, and that's the problem on how those of the Greatest Generation talk about their experience. All I know about my grandfather's experience in the Second World War is the following. He was a corpsman on the USS Essex. His commander came down to him one day and said, "I have bad news. You're going ashore with the first wave on Taro Red Beach 1. And he survived that, and then he survived the bombing of the USS Essex later that year. And I know that story, and I have his presidential unit citation. What types of information did your grandfather tell you about the war, if anything at all?
Well, I think that it's an interesting question. He really was thinking all about the future. I think his commitment to the age group that we call the Greatest Generation today was foremost on his mind. He knew that he was at the end of his career, and he was always thinking about the future. He really was. I got much more information out of my father, John, who, get this folks, graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point on D-Day. Yeah, that was quite a spectacle, actually, I think. I called him once on the telephone, and I said, "Well, I just want to say this is an incredible day." It was June 6th. And he said, "It sure was. I mean, it was really a historic moment." I said, "Oh, is that the way you look at your graduation?" He said, well, he hadn't quite anticipated that. But anyway, my father went was in combat in World War II. They graduated in 1944, but his class did deploy for Europe. And my father was part of, and he did talk about it. My father was in one of the units, well, any unit that was near any of the Holocaust sites. We didn't know that's what they were at the time. General Eisenhower, having gone to Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald, couldn't believe what he saw. They knew that there were forced labor camps and other really dreadful places, but had absolutely no idea of what was actually going on in these places. And apparently, it was clear as they drove into Ohrdruf, which was, as I said, a subcamp of Buchenwald, that something really bad was there because you could smell rotting human flesh from miles away. And so Dwight Eisenhower goes into this camp. He using his own words, checked out every nook and cranny, literally had the full tour. George Patton actually couldn't go into the camp because he was sick. He was sick from the smell, and that's sort of interesting. But if you look at the pictures of Dwight Eisenhower at Ohrdruf, you ought to see the way his jaw is set. I never saw that as a kid. And so after that was over that evening, he wrote to George Marshall, General Marshall, and said, "I want you to send reporters, as many members of Congress here. We have to chronicle this, or people will say it never happened." They put it down to publicity. It's Dwight Eisenhower that ordered literally every unit, military unit that was anywhere near the camps that had been discovered to go in and take photographs. So my father was an amateur photographer and went in to Buchenwald and took a whole album worth of pictures of what he saw at the Holocaust, and we were raised on those pictures. We were raised on those pictures. As a matter of fact, my father showed those pictures to my children. He showed those pictures to his great-grandchildren. My father wanted them to know. But Granddad, you know, he didn't talk about it. And I think he, except on one other occasion, sorry, I just have to add this because you'll be amused. Somebody had given him a map of, I think, D-Day +2 or something, you know, where the large, they're barrage balloons. You know that picture where you see some ships probably unloading supplies or whatever, but they'd already at that beach really secured things. And I asked him about this picture. And he opened up this console, and inside were a bunch of maps related to D-Day. And he gave me the 6th grade version of the invasion of Normandy. But so he would answer questions, but he just didn't talk about it otherwise.
Well, we are obviously at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, and so we have to always integrate at least one question and bring in Ford. And I was actually struck by this when I was reading your book, and the fact is that both of them had horrible tempers when they were children, really bad tempers, and each of their mothers were able to wean them away from these tempers. How did his mom do that? We know the Ford story, but how did his mom do that?
Well, I must say, I mean, there's so many reasons to love being here, but I was an enormous Jerry Ford fan. As a matter of fact, I campaigned for him very energetically, and I did. And I met him a couple of times somewhere on the campaign trail, and I never saw any sign of that temper. I'm supposed to laugh. We don't show our tempers on the campaign trail, but no, he was charming. He really was.
Some do.
Huh?
Some do.
Okay. Well, I must say that. There's a wonderful scene. Granddad remarked at the time. He, by the way, was a great writer. So if you want to hear his voice, he wrote a book called At Ease: Stories I Tell to Friends. And it's really a romp, and it's a great read. And I asked my father why it's such a good book, and he said because Ike wrote every word of that himself, did not have any help with it, because he was also a speechwriter for Douglas MacArthur, so you didn't want to be a speechwriter either, because he would do a massive editing job. But in any case, he one evening threw a temper tantrum because his two older brothers were allowed to go trick-or-treating, and the parents decided he was too young, and he threw a fit, drew blood and the whole thing. And I think he got probably a hickory switch on his backside, and he went up to whimper and Pam, and sniff and carry on in bed. And his mother, who was a very religious woman, came up and said to him very quietly. First of all, she waited until he stopped putting on a performance, and she said to him very quietly. She paraphrased the Bible by saying, "He who conquereth his soul is greater than he who taketh a city." And then she said, "And who did you hurt today? Your brothers are out trick-or-treating. They have no idea that you are angry and feel left out. You're the only one with the bloody fists and the, whatever it was." So she later said that of her 7 boys, she had 6 surviving boys, if you can imagine. She said that of all of her children, Dwight Eisenhower had the most to learn. I don't think that's a compliment, right? But that he was a very passionate man. And, this is, I think, one of the most interesting things about him in the war, because he manages to really keep it cool in a lot of very, very tense situations. And I think she helped him a lot in figuring out how to manage this. So 2 seconds on how he managed it. He became a great diarist, and and there are lots of books on Eisenhower's diaries. You can read, what he thought on a day-to-day basis. I think he thought they were going to be private. Well, that was another miscalculation, okay? So he would let off steam that way. The Philippine diaries, by the way, with General MacArthur, oh my gosh, there are some really great scenes in that diary. So he let off steam that way, but he also later had a habit of writing the thing that bothered him most down on a piece of paper and crumpling it up and throwing it away. So he was a little bit of ahead of his time in what we call visualization. I'd be advised to put what's bothering me on a chair, get it out of here, put it on a chair, get up and walk around the chair. So his White House associates, I was very fortunate to know many of them, told me that he rarely lost his temper. It's just when he got up and excused himself, everyone went. Anyway, that's the Eisenhower version of how to take care of that problem.
One thing that as myself as a World War II historian, I've always it's hard to wrap your head around. Oftentimes, is Eisenhower's meteoric rise during the war. I mean, first of all, he was a colonel in 1940, promoted to brigadier general within 6 months. Within 6 months, he was promoted to brigadier general. Just before the start of the war, again, he's promoted to brigadier, and he's made a 2-star. Very quickly on again, sent to Washington. And then the next thing you know, he's the supreme commander of all the Allied forces in Europe. General Marshall obviously saw something incredible in your grandfather. What do you think General Marshall saw in him that rose him above so many other senior commanders at that particular time?
Well, I think there are 2 rather unknown stories, if I may
Please.
Present those. First of all, when you write a book, you think, oh, well, history, the wonderful thing about history is that it has a beginning and an end, and you don't have to be, you have to know what you're talking about there, but it's kind of definable. And then my book came out in 2020, and I'm very proud of that book, but I have to tell you, if I had known there was going to be a pandemic in the United States of America, I would have written a whole chapter on Dwight Eisenhower and the Spanish flu influenza, because he was not sent to the front during World War I. A big gripe, by the way, that plenty of generals had about him in World War II. Oh, you never served in combat. Okay, well, what he was doing was he was the first commander of tank forces in the United States military. He and George Patton were big tank enthusiasts, and he was at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They were using Pickett's Charge and other places on that battlefield. They didn't choose to do that. It was the government that told them that's where they were going to do their tank training because, well, frankly speaking, they didn't really have any tanks. But they were using trucks largely, and it was Ike's job to train them how to shoot from moving vehicles. And then finally a tank arrived before they were about to all ship out. But he couldn't keep these guys entertained enough, couldn't give them enough jobs to do, couldn't really keep them busy, so he had to negotiate with the townfolk, don't give them anything to drink, that kind of thing. But then set up a little school to teach them how to do things that might come in useful if they're reassigned outside of the tank corps. They learned Morse code and all of these other things would be very handy. So that seemed to occupy a lot of them. But then in September of 1918, 2 officers come into the camp who have the Spanish flu, and it ripped through the camp. So it started out as a small camp. He had, by that time, 10,000 men under his command. He was 27 years old. Okay, and so he, contacts the War Department and says, what do we do about this? And they said, what Spanish flu? What are you talking about? What kind of an illness is this? I think they knew perfectly well, but were afraid to begin some kind of, frighten people so that, recruitment or anything else that was necessary for the war would become a problem. So he had to make it up as he went along. And are you ready for this, folks? He implemented isolation, wearing masks, and a whole range of things like that. And then after World War I was over, his medical team reported to the War Office, and it was regarded as best practices in pandemic management at Camp Cold. And by that time, a tank had arrived. The tankers are on their way to the front in Europe, and Dwight Eisenhower was just behind them, and when he got to the train station, quite literally, the armistice had been signed. But I can tell you this, at the age of 28, the following year, he got his Distinguished Service Medal for what he did at Camp Cold. He led these guys, he kept them calm, he got them through the pandemic, and he got them trained. And so that's one thing. So the military already knew about him. The second thing, which is really important, directly to this meteoric rise at the end. Oh, he also graduated #1 in his class at Command and General Staff School. Yeah. Then the Louisiana maneuvers, and this is the critical thing. George Marshall had an extraordinary way of leading men. And part of it was he was going to have the best people around him. And he was watching everybody's performance through one of the most interesting military operations we've had in the United States of America. The United States military took over the entire state of Louisiana and practiced a big war game, including, by the way, amphibious landings and everything else you can imagine. And Ike was the chief of staff for General Kruger's Third Army in that maneuver. And he was the mastermind of the victory of the Third Army at the Louisiana maneuvers. He gets 1 star, and that's why he gets a star so quickly. 1 star for the Louisiana maneuvers, and then Marshall, having observed everybody's performance and his specifically, invites him into war plans just after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So one of the most iconic photos during the Second World War, I'm sure you all know it, is Dwight Eisenhower with the 101st Airborne Division they're about ready to take off and jump into Normandy. Of course, everyone knows the story. Everyone knows the story of the jumping, what they were trying to do, and it was Dwight Eisenhower who actually insisted on that jump. Lee Mallory comes to him and says, we shouldn't do this. The casualties are going to be horrendous. It could be as many as 50%. And General Eisenhower sticks to his guns and decides that it's very important to have those causeways open, and the only way that can do that is with the airborne jumping in. And because of this, he knows that the casualties are going to be high. He goes and visits the troops. Now, the E word is often thrown around quite a lot today, and that's the empathy. How much empathy did you see and witness in your grandfather, the kind of empathy that he showed on that early morning before all those boys got into those planes?
Well, you're right. The predictions were 50% of the airborne and 70% of the glider forces. They were going to be bringing in, equipment. These gliders are amazing if you haven't seen them, but they're basically canvas and wood. And so they were critical because they had to clear the causeway so the guys could get off of Utah Beach. And Utah Beach was critical because the American objective was Cherbourg. And so the whole operation actually probably hung pretty much around the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division. The British paratroopers weren't in the same peril at all. And by the way, a German division had just moved into the area. I think it takes a lot of guts to go look people in the eye if you think they're not going to come home this afternoon. And especially young men. You see, you have to remember that my grandparents lost their first child, a son named Dowd Dwight, at the age of 3. And Dow Dwight would have been part of the Greatest Generation had he lived. And he was about the same age as those paratroopers. And the death of that son, Ike said, was the hardest thing that happened in his whole life. So to go out there and look at these young men who were his deceased son's age, as it were, must have been very, very hard. So, well, I think there's a wonderful Michigan connection, is there not? Would you like to tell that part of the story?
No,
okay.
Absolutely not. No,
well,
the floor is yours.
You,
I'm just moderating today.
If you look at that, the most famous picture, probably, of Dwight Eisenhower talking to the 101st Airborne Division, he's looking very serious. It looks like he's giving them a pep talk, go beat Hitler, go get them boys, the whole thing. Well, actually, the tall paratrooper in the picture, number 23, that's how you can identify him when you look at this picture, was a man named Wally Strobel from Michigan. And what they were talking about was fly fishing.
Yep.
So in this picture, he's going like this, and he's got his hand like this, and it looks like he's making a really dramatic point. He is casting a line. Yeah, well, so my father was kind of my mentor too, because we were both interested, as my brother David is, the three of us are interested in all the same subjects. And so I asked my father, why would you be talking about fly fishing when these guys are about to get on a plane and go to their uncertain fate? And he said, well, that's precisely why you talk about fly fishing. He knew that they were probably a little panicky, afraid that they would never come back. But unfortunately, they didn't know that the Supreme Commander had been told that 50% weren't coming back. But to have the courage to go do that, he talked to others about sports scores, and the whole idea was to make them feel relaxed, make them know that he, the boss, cared hugely about their welfare and where they were from. And then finally, to be reminded of home, that everyone was going to welcome them home. And I myself met Wally Strobel, and it was Wally Strobel who told my father and me, and I think another family member, that it was about fly fishing. So that's wonderful. But the other thing I think I'd leave you with on this is that after that, he went back to his trailer and wrote a note in case of failure. And basically he goes through, if the invasion fails, he goes through the fact that everybody was well trained, everybody did their duty, everybody was devoted to the cause, etc. And then he said at the end of it, if there's any blame that attaches to this operation, it's mine and mine alone. Because he was the man who argued for widening Omaha Beach and adding Utah Beach. It was his plan, as were the airborne troops. Well, we know today that the numbers were nothing like what were predicted. And so he was, immensely relieved, but this was a really tough decision within a week of the operation. And I don't know, it's in my book, but I was very moved by the fact that I think it was the 82nd Airborne had their reunion, and he went to that reunion in the 1950s. And the one person who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, who is still alive, got up and gave a very eloquent speech about how General Eisenhower had to make one of the toughest decisions of the war. And we were there with him, and we understood, and we were going to go do our duty and the rest of it. And Dwight Eisenhower wept openly. Wept openly. So you want to talk about, he was a very emotional person. And if you read his diaries, oh, by the way, read his love letters. Wow. I wrote a book called Mrs. Ike about my grandmother and their marriage, and lots of those love letters are in there, signing it, your lover for all these years. Okay.
So I'm going to try to ask two more questions.
Sorry
We're running out of
about
time,
that.
and I want to be able to get to yours as well. We're probably going to go a little long today, but it's Susan Eisenhower. I think we can go a little long, right? My favorite story from your book, and there are a lot of really good ones in there, is the and I don't want to tell the story. You're going to tell the story, but you ask your grandfather, why didn't we involve ourselves in Hungary? Now, can you relate that story?
Well, in 1956 was a heck of a year, I mean, for the Eisenhower presidency, because we had both the Suez crisis and the Hungarian uprising. And this all happened, by the way, during election year. So the President of the United States announces that he will not be campaigning, and this wasn't a basement strategy. This is, I mean, we are in the middle of whether we're going to have World War III or not. He was trying to keep the Soviet Union from meddling in Middle East, this Middle East crisis in Suez, and unfortunately, on the other side of the story were our wartime allies. France, England, and Israel made plans to overthrow the president of Egypt, which was in violation of international law and would have produced results that would have had an enormous effect on the economy. As it was bad enough. But he was managing this crisis. By the way, they didn't tell the United States of America they were working behind our backs. Our own allies didn't. And I don't think that's a thing you did to the guy who put the alliance together in the first place. So anyway, he was in the middle of that. And also, there were uprisings in Hungary. And the Soviet Union, was making noises like it was going to intervene in Hungary. Well, it was not U.S. policy to be talking about liberating captive countries. And, it's a long story, but certainly some of our broadcasters had broadcast into those areas, Voice of America and others, had given more encouragement to the uprising than we had an appetite for, given the fact that we were in the middle of another enormous crisis, and it was not, our policy was containment, not rollback. So I don't know. My fifth grade, let's see, would that be right? Fifth or sixth grade, maybe it was seventh grade, history teacher is very good, but he sent me home with some questions. Let's see. Yeah, 50s. Oh, okay, well, this is later, right? Sent me home with questions, and I knew this wasn't going to go down well because Granddad didn't like it very much when people used his grandchildren as emissaries to ask questions. But I so admired this history teacher. I mean, he really got me very interested in history, very much so, and in every way. All right, so I went in there. First of all, the first question was, when did you last see Georgy Zhukov? All right, so Granddad was like, oh, I think it was 1956. He gave me a transistor radio for my birthday. Okay, well, that's interesting. Georgy Zhukov, as you remember, was the commander of Soviet forces during World War II. They were our allies on the Eastern Front. Okay, well, that was interesting. And then, Granddad, if you've got another minute, I have to ask you, I'm looking at my piece of paper here. Why didn't you intervene during the Hungarian uprising? He crossed his legs and says, what, start World War III? Okay. Oh, okay. It's like, oh, is that what you do with your day job? Okay.
So I'm gonna end with this. Your grandfather's farewell address is one of my absolutely all-time favorites. I teach global history here as well as do this job here once a week, and I actually read a good portion of that farewell address to my students. It is about 64 years since that speech, and it is one of the most important ever in our republic. Where he talks about the military-industrial complex, how winners get chosen, how losers get chosen, where our bases will be, and as well as the kind of cross-section between kind of government, industry, and technology coming into play. Do you have anything to add about that, or any comments to make before we get to the audience?
Well, there's another warning in that speech about the scientific technological elite, which has some resonance for today. He talks about when public policy is influenced by the relationship between government and high technology enterprises. Wow. Okay, that's an interesting speech. The military-industrial complex, I think, was deeply influenced by a debate. Ike had an average approval rating during his administration of 68%.
That's
and
amazing.
I think in the beginning, and that held up over the course of his 8 years. But in the beginning, I think everybody thought he was untouchable. But after his heart attack in 1955, and actually going into the midterm elections of 58 and eventually the presidential campaign in 1960, that the other party saw him as somewhat vulnerable, mostly to pin Nixon to whatever they were going to say about the Eisenhower administration because he was going to run in 60. Well, there was a bomber gap. They're accused of Eisenhower not preparing, adequately to create the kind of deterrence necessary to disabuse the Soviet Union of any ambitions it might have. Bomber gap, then we had the missile gap. And the missile gap, I think, was extremely unfair because they were pressuring the president to say things about classified information publicly, and he wouldn't do it. So this becomes a theme all the way into the 1960 election. And then it wasn't hard to know that a lot of the leakage that was coming from places were coming from people who had primary, but I think mostly secondary evidence of reports that had been done internally. The one that suggested the bomber gap was actually a report that was talking about capability, not plans. Well, anybody's capable of anything. So you could argue whether that was the truth or not. The point is that Eisenhower couldn't say anything about it. No, there wasn't a missile gap. We actually had superiority, 10-1 superiority over the Soviet Union, and he knew it. But he couldn't defend himself and therefore defend his running mate in that election. In any case, the farewell address is something around that issue, I think, because what happened is that even some of his colleagues from World War II, took up the a more political approach to these things. And a lot of them, I think there were almost 2,000 industrial lobbyists on Capitol Hill at that time. And so he understood that this could prove to be a source of deep concern in the future.
Okay, let's go to the audience.
Can I say one more thing real quick?
Sure, absolutely.
The word balance is used at least 7 times in this speech. And I just want to, as we're going to turn these questions over to the audience, I'd like to say it's one more reason why I love being here at the Ford Library and Museum, because there was another man of balance. Another man of balance. Balance in and among national programs, a balance in the way you look at your governance, a balance in the way you talk to people, a balance,
Yeah.
And it's this kind of balance that we need so badly today, which is one more reason why Michigan is one of the most wonderful places to come have this conversation.
All right, we have time for, I think as many questions as we want. Raise your hand, please. And by the way, if you stay longer, we're going to reward you with a wonderful dessert reception, so don't go anywhere. Yes? Do you have a microphone?
Is it on?
Here we go.
My father served under General Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. And he also was one who didn't speak much of his experiences. And I apologize for my lack of knowledge, but this week has inspired me to learn more. But can you tell me where Supreme Headquarters was located? I think my father was in England and also France. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, Supreme Commander Headquarters moved around. It was at Telegraph Cottage and around that area outside of London for a while.
Yes.
Then it moved to something they called Wide Wing, and then it did move to France,
Yes.
to a place called Shellburst, which was their headquarters, and then to Granville. And so now I would like to say that there is and Brian, you should know this too, there is a SHAFE Veterans organization.
Oh.
And actually, I meet with them every year, but they've had an extraordinary, two of their members who used to come to the meetings all the time actually reported the German unconditional surrender back to Washington. So you might like to connect with them because they
Yes.
know the history of this very well, and if I can help in any way, by all means.
Well, I've got his uniform and his medals, his dog tags, and like I said, this has inspired me to learn more. And
Well, I think in France, actually, in Granville, they were there for longer. This is all part of the Normandy breakout.
yeah.
If I could spend 2 seconds, too, just telling you this wonderful story, but Ike was in a plane crash. I think this was pretty well suppressed for a long time, but he couldn't get to Granville fast enough for something that was going on, so he persuaded somebody to take him in a 2-passenger plane, and the plane crashed not that far from Mont Saint-Michel. He ends up in this chateau for a month with his knee up on a couch. It was not his football knee, but the other knee, so he was having difficulty walking. And if I could just tell you this wonderful little story, the French locals discovered that the Supreme Commander and part of SHAFE is hanging around this chateau, not too far from where the headquarters were. And they brought him 2 cows for warm milk, which is exceedingly kind. But the problem is that none of Eisenhower's staff knew how to milk a cow. So the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces Europe had to get some crutches and go out to the barn and teach the household staff how to milk a cow.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what is about to follow right now is a very gratuitous plug for the National Archives and Records Administration, sir. If you want to get your father's or grandfather's or father's records, you can request them from the National Archives. And then once you get those, you can go to College Park, Maryland, where the archives we have of the Second World War is more than you will ever need to find out anything and everything about the service.
Well, they'd love to see you in Normandy, and they would. And out by Granville, they're going to be making a big deal about the second forward quarters there.
Next question.
You talked about how the greatest generation brought unity to the United States. Surely, I know there was some dissent in World War II. What do you think it would take for us to return to that kind of climate, I guess?
I think it's a great question. I've thought a lot about why these presidents who had been part of the greatest generation, and I hope you'll allow my grandfather to be somewhere in that mix because he was born in 1890.
He's in.
Huh?
He's in.
Oh, okay, all right. That's good. So first of all, they had something then that we don't have now, which was a common goal and a common experience. And so, and you can see, so members of Congress and these presidents were dealing with other members of Congress who were veterans, World War II veterans. They understood each other, both sides of the aisle did, in uncommon ways. Now, the question is, how do we get to a point where we have shared goals and shared experiences? And I think that's a lot tougher, but I don't think the solution is hiding in our own little silos where we're part of an echo chamber and we're all making each other feel better no matter which side you're on, right? I think that the question is reaching out to people who are different, who have different views, and sort of making some fun. I mean, in the most positive of ways, of engaging them in conversation. I'm forcing my students to do that. I'm also forcing them to turn off their telephones. And no, I mean, they're not allowed in my class. And
Not in mine either.
No,
No phones.
and no artificial intelligence. They might want to use that later when they use them as tools, but they got to learn how to think first. And so, you know, those kinds of things that take away, to revitalize, you know, American life. We've got, if you go to restaurants, people are all on their phones. You see families sitting there and everybody's got their phone on. I'm not sure why it's worth paying $100 for dinner and nobody's talking to each other, but okay. And then I think one other thing I'd say is that there's hope for me in the fact I'm an independent voter. And there's hope for me in the fact that independent voters today are not only the largest voting bloc in the United States of America, but larger than both Democrats and Republicans combined. And that means there's a massive opportunity for somebody to come in and talk to people who have actively decided to wait to hear out both sides and to see what they come up with. I remain optimistic, and even though there are days when it just feels all too heavy because I'm still trying to survive really dangerous Washington traffic. Now everybody's angry, and it shows. Turn signals are optional, red lights, what are those? And you know, it's a kind of a scary place from that point of view, but I just refuse to be pessimistic because it is the use of energy towards a negative as opposed to the use of energy towards a positive.
I think we have time for just two. I think we have time just for two more, please. Two more questions.
What was your relationship with the Vice President Nixon at the time? Kind of growing up in the White House while your grandfather was president. What was your relation with the Vice President?
Okay, well that's a great question. My relationship with Richard Nixon. Well, first of all. There are some days, and I didn't actually grow up in the White House, but we lived very close to my grandparents, both during their presidency, at least in the second term, and then we lived very close to them on adjacent property when they retired to Gettysburg. So in those days, I only saw the Vice President a couple of times, but my brother married Richard Nixon's daughter, Julie. So that is certainly one connection. But rather ironically, I spent about 2.5 or 3 months with President and Mrs. Nixon on the 3rd floor of the White House. It's a long story, but I went down there in my senior year of school, high school, to open mail in my senator's mail room during the invasion of Cambodia and in the aftermath of that. And my family found out that I was on the loose in Washington, D.C. So Julie, I don't know, talked to her parents, I guess, and the next thing I find out I'm on the 3rd floor of the White House during this whole crisis. And I really got to know him and Mrs. Nixon very well. She was lovely. And anything you read about, you know, Plastic Pat and all that is just, it's just a bunch of people who wanted to attack this family for something that is off limits as far as I'm concerned. First ladies report for duty every day, and they are always amazing in terms of what they give back to the country, and they, you know, and the service they provide to lift up great causes and other things. Pat was no exception, Mrs. Nixon. But I was there during a very, very interesting time. Thousands of people were in the streets of Washington, and I'd stand up there on the 3rd floor and look out at all my fellow students who were demonstrating. I was opening their mail in the White House mail. That was a really weird experience, but let me say, opening that mail in the White House mailroom had a profound effect on me. I couldn't believe how much hate there was in this country. And so I'm not going to get into a discussion about anything other than the fact that we blame everybody else for the atmosphere in this country. Let's start right here. Let's start right here about how we describe what it is that upsets us and what the challenge is. And let's be clear about it, and then be clear about it in a respectful way. A lot of people have different reasons for being angry, and everybody has a point of view, though some people are flat out crazy. But I mean, on all sides, because they're called extremists, which is why there is a middle ground in this country. But we wouldn't get leaders that we don't approve of, and I'm talking about both Democrats and Republicans, I'm trying to be nonpartisan here, without it being some kind of a reflection on us. And I think now is the time really for us to examine ourselves, get closer to our kids and our families, and pursue a few random acts of kindness. I go to the great state of Maine a lot. People are so kind there, and if somebody does something really nice to me, which is really quite often, total strangers, I feel like I have to go back to Washington and pay it back. And of course, I get to Washington and they think, well, I'm probably the first female serial killer. I mean, how do you come do something randomly nice for somebody in Washington? They don't quite get that yet, but that's been around forever. It's a transactional city, and as my grandfather once said, the problem with Washington is everyone's too far away from home. And so we have to have empathy even for the people there who are anxious, who are losing their jobs, who can't sell their houses, and then other people who feel like they're now sidelined. So a little of that empathy, I think, is going to go a long way, because this is a very kind country. We're one of the most philanthropic nations in the world, and we just need to re-tap back into that.
Last question, please. Here in the middle.
Thank you. Oh, hi. Oh God, this is embarrassing. Anyways, how did Ike or Mamie feel about the Nixons, particularly Richard Nixon or Dick Nixon, whatever? But how did she feel? I know Pat was amazing and very underrated, but how did they feel about Richard Nixon? Particularly, what did Ike feel about him as a vice president and personally? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I did an inadequate job of answering that question. Yes, I did see a lot of the Nixons while I was there at the White House. This was well before Watergate, but I was very conscious of the peace talks that were underway in Paris to end the Vietnam War, and he was committed to ending the Vietnam War. It's just that this was an extremely, extremely complicated situation. I learned, some interesting things about strategy from that dinner table conversation. I would say one difference between the Eisenhowers and the Nixons is Granddad didn't talk policy or politics at the dinner hour. My grandmother's pretty clear that when you come home from work, you're all mine. And that actually helped him a lot. I think what I will say is that I think people over-exaggerate the kind of friendship that they would have been required to have, because just remember that Richard Nixon and John Kennedy were about the same age. And they weren't that much older than my own father. So there was a big generational difference, and also my grandparents did not invite people for the weekend for country parties. The only people they invited to the Gettysburg Farm were the likes of Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. And Nikita Khrushchev came once. But it was either all family or it was some other mix of seeing old comrades. So the fact that the Nixons had never come to spend the weekend at the Eisenhower farm means absolutely nothing. The rest of it is open for speculation, but I will say that Richard Nixon was asked to do more than vice presidents traditionally did. He went on round-the-world trips. He absorbed a lot of international energy, whether it was positive or negative. But again, he was of another generation, and I think there were times when Eisenhower was asked to consider other vice presidential candidates, I'm just going to leave it on this note. We did not have a countrywide primary system in those days, so decisions about who running mates were going to be were not necessarily the presidential candidate's decision. I'm talking about in the 1950s.
That's right.
This was much more of a integrated approach with all of the other party leaders. So I think a lot's written about it, but I think I would concentrate on thinking about them as kind of representing different periods of American history. I must say that whatever you want to say about Richard Nixon, he sure produced two beautiful daughters, and that says a lot to me about, you know, it says a lot to me.
Well, so on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library Museum, on behalf of the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee, I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight. What an amazing crowd. We still have some things going on for the week. Please come to we have the World War II Film Festival starting up tomorrow. The guy here in the front row has got this really cool USO-style event going on at the Air Zoo down in Portage. Look into that as well. I do want to thank some of our larger sponsors, many of you who are in the audience. Of course, we could not have done this without the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, our partners in crime, what we do here. As well as Meyer Corporation, our friends at the Air Zoo, and so many more. LMCU, lots of great sponsors who gave us their money so we could do this for them. And that's the key. We did this for them. I've got a new buddy sitting in the back row there by the name of Gene Corey. He is my hero. I love you, buddy. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for what you did. And everyone, for one last time, thank you, Susan Eisenhower, for being here.